Hey guys, this is Griffin Dean, maker of Shadow Tag. Today I wanted to talk about designing for differences in player skill when making a competitive game, how it's been done in the past, and how I went about doing it in Shadow Tag. This topic is huge, so I'll focus primarily on the first-person shooter genre. So why are differences in player skill such an issue? It comes down to cultivating your player base. New players need a foothold to establish themselves, something that shields them from veteran players who can reliably beat them. Without something to keep them going, new players will flounder and you will lose a portion of your audience that feels it cannot compete against more established players. On the other end of the spectrum, you have veteran players who have poured considerable amounts of time into mastering your game. They are dedicated to your product and want to enjoy their investment by poning the noobs, as some might say. These hardcore players are usually a small portion of your overall audience, but they are the ones who will evangelize your game. So whose side should you be on? Back in the day, shooters afforded new players very little slack. Get good or go home was a pervasive attitude. This environment gave experienced players free rein to crush the competition, while new players just had to stick with it until they could hold their own. Before we continue, I need to introduce an important concept called the skill gap. The skill gap is the difference between your most skilled player and your least skilled player. Many modern games use what I call skill gap compression to get new players into their competitive experience. Skill gap compression is essentially limiting how good or bad someone can be at your game by mechanically forcing them towards an average skill level. This is often accomplished by adding randomization to the system. For example, if a player is killed repeatedly, you might give them extra health or a shield when they respawn. Skill gap compression is great for new players, but it can undermine high-level play if it isn't implemented carefully. Compressing the skill gap has two major downsides which primarily affect your hardcore users. First, it devalues their skill set. When a game rewards one player for their poor performance, and that reward negatively impacts other players, there's bound to be friction. It never feels good to lose because of extenuating circumstances. There is a pervasive pattern found in competitive gaming communities. They stamp out randomness wherever they find it. If it's part of the vanilla experience, the community removes it or rejects the game as a viable competitive platform. Why? Because randomness alters performance. Skill gap compression also alters performance by artificially leveling the playing field. The second downside to skill gap compression is that it undermines high-level play. Many hardcore competitive gamers keep coming back to an experience for all the little nuances you learn after mastering the core gameplay. These are things like grenade bounce angles, movement strategies, and obscure tactics that give players that slight but competitive edge. Players work hard to discover and master these techniques. It's the kind of arcane knowledge that keeps players coming back years after a game launches. It gives players a sense of mastery. Skill gap compression can dampen or destroy this sense of mastery if it does too much to mechanically even the odds. However, there's nothing inherently wrong with compressing the skill gap. It's a matter of knowing your audience. Games compress their skill gap because it makes the experience more accessible to a wider audience. It lowers the barrier of entry. It's hard to argue with a tactic that brings in more customers. So how did I deal with differences in player skill when developing Shadow Tag? I didn't. Well, that's not entirely true. I went out on a limb and I performed an experiment. Instead of compressing the skill gap, I tried to eliminate the aggression and frustration many players experience while playing competitive shooters. I spent a lot of time talking to people who didn't like shooters and started to notice several repeated themes. Shooters made them stressed. They were constantly dying, and when they weren't dying, they were worried about dying. They didn't feel like the environment was safe, so they felt uncomfortable experimenting for fear that the game would punish them. They often felt that more experienced shooter players judged them and resented them for simply being new to the game. Shooters themselves are often thematically intense, violent, and aggressive, and they just weren't comfortable with that. I was struck by the fact that many of these people played competitive games in other genres, such as fighting games. It wasn't the competition that was turning people off, it was the shooter's cultural attitude. Shooters take themselves very seriously, and when they don't, it's a unique selling point. They tend to be big, loud, and aggressive, like a mosh pit at a metal concert, and not everybody's into that. But what would happen if you dressed a shooter up like a clown? Everyone loves clowns, it's a known fact. Mechanically, Shadow Tag embraces the get-good-or-go-home ethos of old-school shooters, but thematically it's disguised as a party game. It presents shooter gameplay in a different context, one that mitigates stress, frustration, and aggression. When you die in Shadow Tag, everyone gets to have a good laugh, especially you. Playtesting has shown that players who don't normally enjoy shooters enjoy Shadow Tag. I think this has a lot to do with the game's humorous and lighthearted attitude. This aesthetic encourages new players to persist until they're comfortable and capable. It's a friendlier version of Get Good or Go Home. Feel free to check out Shadow Tag and tell me what you think of this approach. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, that concludes our little program. Hello and good night.
Goodbye!